Vladimir Putin thought that he was on top of everything that involved the peace negotiations between Russia and Ukraine. He had all of the cards, or so he believed, along with enough influence over the United States to ensure that any deal that was hashed out would be far more favorable to Russia than Ukraine or Europe would want it to be. Overconfidence has proven to be Putin's undoing. The Russian president has just received the worst news that he's ever gotten, as both the US and the coalition of the willing have delivered blows to Putin's ambitions of taking over Ukraine. On January 7th, NBC News reported on a meeting between the members of the coalition of the willing in Paris. This coalition is a concept that has been discussed for much of the past year, Sky News reports, and it essentially amounts to a group of nations that claim to be willing to help guarantee Ukraine's security if an end ever comes to the war. Sky News says that the concept exists to allow NATO members to act as a group without any member of that collective defense organization vetoing actions that the rest of the members want to take. Of particular concern are Hungary and Slovakia, both of which are NATO and European Union members that have proven somewhat sympathetic to Putin's cause. The coalition allows NATO members to act without the approval of these two nations. And at the Paris summit, the coalition got a major shot in the arm from a country that had previously been wary of offering it any concrete support. NBC News reports that this coalition summit was the first to have been attended by two of America's key envoys, Steve Witkoff and Jared Kushner. These are the very same envoys that US President Donald Trump sent to Russia for a meeting with Putin's representatives back in December, meaning that they lie at the heart of the US's attempts to broker a peace deal between Russia and Ukraine. The presence of these two individuals alone would have been concerning to Putin, who likely would have hoped to see them as far away from the European nations that are offering security guarantees as possible. However, it's what Witkoff and Kushner said during the summit that will give Russia's president true cause for alarm. Joined by the US's leading general in Europe, Alexis Grinkovich, both Witkoff and Kushner made statements suggesting the US strongly supports something akin to the security protocols that are being offered to Ukraine by the coalition of the willing. Witkoff made the clearest announcement of US support of such protocols. Standing alongside the leaders of Ukraine, Germany, France, and the UK, Trump's special envoy said, "Those security protocols are meant to deter any further attacks in Ukraine, and if there are any attacks, they're meant to defend, and they will do both. They are as strong as anyone has ever seen." Kushner reinforced these statements, adding that security protocols of some sort are needed for a lasting peace, and that it's right for Ukraine to want these protocols to be in place. If Ukraine is to make a final deal, they have to know that after a deal they are secure. They have, obviously, a robust deterrence, and there's real backstops to make sure that this will not happen again, Kushner said. In essence, this seems to be the US saying that it's going to support the presence of the coalition of the willing troops in Ukraine as part of any peace or ceasefire deal that's negotiated with Russia. We say seems because the support for the coalition appears to be implied rather than outright stated. NBC News doesn't report either Witkoff or Kushner outright stating that the coalition of the willing's plans are necessarily what the US would support. Having said that, coalition leaders have also claimed that the allies may take part in a US-led ceasefire monitoring and verification mechanism, likely involving sensors, satellites, and drones. This appears to mean that the US will be keeping tabs on Russia while feeding data back to the coalition, so its troops on the ground can take action whenever necessary. However, this mechanism is proposed and not set in stone. Still, the US choosing to make these comments at a coalition summit appears intended to be a hint for Putin as to where America's current considerations lie. There's also no mention of the US putting any boots on the ground itself. That shouldn't be surprising, as Trump stated back in August that any American contribution would not involve soldiers inside Ukraine. When it comes to security, Europeans are willing to put people on the ground. We're willing to help them with things, especially probably by air, Trump said in an interview with Fox News. Witkoff and Kushner's comments don't seem to contradict these August statements. However, if the Trump administration has proven anything since it came to power in January 2025, it's that the US approach is flexible enough to turn on a dime when need be. Interestingly, Witkoff's and Kushner's comments came just after a week after Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky claimed that the US had offered Ukraine security guarantees over the course of 15 years. The BBC reports that this offer appears to have been made when Zelensky met with Trump in Florida on December 28th, suggesting that these guarantees will be part of a peace plan that the two leaders discussed. Zelensky added that there were still sticking points, including territorial issues related to the Donbass and the Zaporizhzhia nuclear power plant. However, a peace plan that is 90% of the way there came out of the meeting, Zelensky claims, and progress on security guarantees being one of the main takeaways from the day. Zelensky made the importance of such security guarantees clear in the wake of the meeting, Without security guarantees, this war cannot be considered truly over. We cannot acknowledge that it has ended because with such a neighbor, there remains a risk of renewed aggression, Zelensky said. He also suggested that the US seems open to considering a long guarantee of 30, 40, or even 50 years. No comment came from the US at the time, though it's interesting to note that Zelensky's language about the need for security guarantees seems very similar to that used by Witkoff and Kushner at the Paris summit of the Coalition of the Willing. Could that seeming alignment in language mean that Witkoff and Kushner are indicating full US backing for the Coalition of the Willing's plan? Or does it have some other ideas up its sleeve when it comes to what Ukraine's security guarantees should look like? It's difficult to say, but for Putin, the US expressing such support at all is a nightmare that he wasn't expecting to have to deal with when 2025 was drawing to a close. In a little over a week in 2026, the US has already dealt a series of powerful blows to Putin's ambitions of being a true force on the global stage. Those blows include the capture of former Venezuelan President Nicolas Maduro. The Guardian reports that Russia had extended billions of dollars in loans to Maduro before his capture, and it's fair to call Maduro an ally of Putin. There is also chaos on the streets of Iran as mass protests are ongoing, as you will learn if you check out our video on the subject. Iran's regime is another Putin ally, and that regime seems close to being toppled, with the US having already warned Iran against killing protesters, with a threat that Iran could be hit very hard if it does. Russia has also lost Shadow Fleet vessels to US detainment, and it now faces the prospect of dealing with secondary sanctions after Trump gave his approval for a bill that would impose tariffs of up to 500% on nations that buy Russia's energy products. The US now showing support for security guarantees that Putin absolutely doesn't want is another shot against a Russian president who is already reeling. The one bright spot for Putin came from reports that the language used to describe the US backing of Ukraine had been watered down. That's according to NBC, which reports on Zelensky offering his thanks for the comments made by Witkoff and Kushner. Zelensky thanks the US for its readiness to be a backstop in all areas, security guarantees, monitoring a ceasefire and rebuilding. NBC says that statement wasn't explicitly endorsed by the White House. It also lacked mention of the use of US capabilities as part of a multinational force in Ukraine, which NBC claims were present in an earlier draft of Zelensky's statement. Whatever hope that Putin may have felt over what seems to be the US giving itself some wiggle room when it comes to its backing of security guarantees for Ukraine may soon be dashed, however. On January 8th, Euronews reported on Zelensky's claim that joint Ukraine-US security guarantees are now ready and that all they need is Trump's approval. Zelensky called the document essentially ready to be finalized. There is no Trump signature yet, but now Trump's pen will be hanging like the sword of Damocles over Putin's head, which is likely exactly how Trump wants things to be. With all of this talk of the Coalition of the Willing, you have to expect that the group was far from silent as the US made its huge announcement, and it wasn't. Delivering a follow-up shot to Putin, members of that coalition have made it very clear that they will be first in line to send troops into Ukraine as part of any peace or ceasefire deal. Those countries are France and the UK, both of which, the BBC reports, signed a declaration of intent on deploying troops into Ukraine if a peace deal is reached. That news broke a day before Witkoff and Kushner made their comments at the Paris summit. The UK's Prime Minister, Keir Starmer, offered some details covering what this statement of intent means, noting that the UK and France have committed to establishing military hubs across Ukraine that they hope will play a role in deterring any future Russian invasion, should a peace deal be reached. French President Emmanuel Macron added that thousands of troops may be deployed under this commitment. The BBC also said that the coalition allies had largely agreed on security guarantees for Ukraine, along with suggesting the previously mentioned proposal that the US could play a role in monitoring any truce between Ukraine and Russia. Territory is still an issue, of course, but it now seems to be one of the few that remain. It's a big stumbling block, of course. BBC says that Russia occupies about 20% of Ukraine as we move into 2026, including much of the Donbass region that Putin wants Ukraine to cede as part of a peace deal. Much depends on whether Ukraine and Russia can come to any sort of agreement on this territory. Without that agreement, the pledge made by France and the UK, along with the backing offered by the US, means little as the Ukraine war will continue to rage. Still, the declaration of intent is an important step, as Starmer notes. This is a vital part of our commitment to stand with Ukraine for the long term, the UK's Prime Minister said of the deal. It paves the way for the legal framework under which British, French, and partner forces could operate on Ukrainian soil, securing Ukraine's skies and seas and regenerating Ukraine's armed forces for the future. Canada's CBC is more effusive about the news of these security guarantees. In its January 6th report, it said that Ukraine had received a series of concrete security guarantees that were backed by over 30 countries. That may well be the case behind the scenes, though it seems that only the UK and France have publicly committed to putting troops on the ground with their declaration of intent. Germany has yet to make a similar commitment, with German Chancellor Friedrich Merz saying only that his country is not fundamentally ruling anything out. German soldiers arriving in Ukraine could be an option, though Germany seems to be waiting to see what happens before making any firm commitments. But again, all of this only matters if Russia agrees to a peace deal. And that said deal involves security guarantees for Ukraine, there are several reasons why these guarantees will matter. As the BBC said back in August 2025, the very notion of security guarantees seems somewhat fluid, as the term could range from boots on the ground to the implementation of even more financially crippling sanctions on Russia than are already in place. But ultimately, any guarantee needs to be strong enough to prevent Putin from getting any ideas about a follow-up invasion after a peace deal is reached. His first full attempt has already failed to deliver results that he wanted after nearly 4 years of fighting. The worry is that Putin would use a peace or ceasefire deal to regroup and try again when he feels ready. Potential evidence that this is Putin's plan comes from Russia's insistence that Ukraine not become a part of NATO and that the size of the country's military is reduced. These seem like obvious attempts to force Ukraine into a weakened state that would benefit Russia for a future invasion. As great as the news of the UK and French declaration, along with US backing of security guarantees, is for Zelensky, there is still a problem to confront. This problem was made clear by The Guardian on January 8th, as it reported that Zelensky claims that there has been no unequivocal answer from Ukraine's European allies on how they would respond were Russia to attack Ukraine again. Zelensky still doesn't know if a follow-up invasion would lead to the countries that have committed to backing a security guarantee actually stepping up to defend Ukraine directly, and that's a clear concern for Zelensky. I personally very much want to get a very simple answer. Yes, if there is aggression again, all partners will give a strong response to the Russians. And that's the exact question I put to all our partners, and so far, I haven't received a clear, unequivocal answer, Zelensky said. The BBC adds that there is also one interesting difference in the language that Ukraine and the US have used. We mentioned that language earlier, though we didn't touch on the BBC's point, that the US often uses the term security protocols rather than security guarantees. It could be that these terms are interchangeable. However, it's also possible that the US uses the word protocols to give itself some wiggle room in terms of what it will offer and how it will respond if Russia breaks a peace agreement or ceasefire. A guarantee is a promise. As for a protocol, that can be altered. It's also interesting that Zelensky's initial proclamation that the declaration of intent signed by the UK and France has been tempered by comments that he made later. In addition to mentioning the lack of a concrete answer to the question of what happens if Russia does invade again, Zelensky also said that while he appreciates and is thankful for the political will shown by Ukraine's allies, legally binding security guarantees are what's needed. But as long as we don't have such security guarantees, legally binding, supported by parliaments, supported by the United States Congress, this question cannot be answered. Zelensky said of the prospect of those offering the guarantees actually stepping up to fight if needed. He added that even if they do, you still have to rely primarily on your own strength. This isn't Zelensky suddenly being unappreciative. It's Ukraine's president offering a dose of reality. Stated support and declarations of intent are important on the foundational level, but they don't mean much until those making those statements and declarations legally bind themselves to them. As for Russia, it's furious over the developments of the last couple of days. Even without anything legally binding, Russia has taken the US, UK and French statements as threats, and it's claimed that any foreign troops that enter Ukraine would become targets. A statement from Moscow said as much in the wake of the announcement of the UK and France's declaration of intent, as reported by Reuters. Russia warns that the deployment of Western military units, military facilities, depots, and other infrastructure on Ukrainian territory will be classified as foreign intervention, posing a direct threat to the security of not only Russia, but also other European countries. All such units and facilities will be considered legitimate combat targets of the Russian armed forces. In other words, any Western soldiers deployed in Ukraine will essentially be considered part of the war that Putin is waging. Russia has also claimed that the West is trying to create an axis of war, which is a bit rich when it's Russia that has been fighting to take control of Ukraine for almost 4 years. These comments gel with those previously made by Russia in August 2025. As Pravda reports, Russia was saying that any NATO troops operating on Ukraine's soil would be unacceptable even back then. This essentially indicates Russia's lack of willingness to agree to any sort of peace deal that would offer a security guarantee strong enough to lead any pro-Ukraine troops on the ground inside Ukraine. After all, where else could these troops come from other than the Western nations that currently support Ukraine? Most nations that are actively supporting Ukraine right now are also part of NATO, including France, the UK, and the US. Russia's reiteration of its refusal to accept any Western troops entering Ukraine amounts to the country saying that it won't sign a peace deal that includes a security guarantee that involves the coalition of the willing or the type of guarantee, or protocol, that the US now says that it supports. Ultimately, these types of comments are why Zelensky is looking for something even more concrete than what we've just seen. Putin will be worried about such a strong commitment being expressed for security guarantees, especially as backing is now being offered by one of the few nations that has the sheer military strength to back up what it says. But everything from security guarantees to how they're executed is conditional on peace being agreed. Russia has indicated that it won't declare peace if it means that Western troops enter Ukraine. Perhaps now the job of Ukraine and the West is to place Putin under so much pressure that he will have no choice but to accept. Ukraine is doing a pretty good job of that, as it continuously proves that Russian claims to have taken territory in Ukraine are false. Pokrovsk, for which Russia has pushed for almost 2 years, is one city that Putin's cronies claim has been captured. It hasn't been. We know that because Ukraine's forces just struck a Russian convoy hard on the outskirts of Pokrovsk, causing that convoy to lose everything. Find out more in our video and remember to subscribe to The Military Show for more videos examining the state of security guarantees for Ukraine. And thank you, as always, for watching.